speedrun time. Here we go. Thanks again, guys. Everybody remains calm. I appreciate it. Hopefully, this isn't too much for people. Still a different thing with the tier 1. Let's go. So we got a Caro Kann here. Now we have a Caro Kann here. Yes, C6 is a bad faith move. I'm blocking the knight's development. Okay, so we have our first advanced Caro, guys. We have our first advanced Caro. And Simon, yeah, thanks again for the 8,000 bits. You're the man. Appreciate it. Okay, now what's the main move here? We can all agree that the Caro Kann is all pawns and no talk. So I play c5 in my blitz games, but that's not what we're going to play here. f4. So the reason the Caro Kann exists is because we get a chance to develop the bishop outside of the pawn chain, and that's exactly what we have done. So he goes f4. That is not a very good move, and he's trying to grab more of the center, but in doing so, he's curbing the development of the bishop, and he's weakening his king. And the proper continuation here is to play e6. So after the game, this is our first advanced Caro, and I'll explain the sort of like, why do we even do any of this? What is the rationale behind this? And one of the rationales is that we get a closed center. And the first thing to understand about the closed center, I'll expand on this more after the game. Thank you, McLovin to the 5. Thank you so much. First thing to understand about the closed center is that oftentimes it consists of pawn chains. And we see a pawn chain here, we see a pawn chain here, right? Blue is... Speaking of blue and red, pawns are fighting each other. Blue pawns are the black pawn chain, and d4 and e5 is white's pawn chain. And the side that has more levers and more ability to attack and undermine the other side's pawn chain is the side that holds a very big initiative. And the rationale behind the Caro Kann is that black is the side that holds more of an ability to attack white's pawn chain. On the other side, white has more space, and those two things are often what counterbalance each other. But first of all, we don't want to yield this prime parking spot so easily, right? We want to trade on our own terms. What does that mean? It means that this bishop should be replaced by a knight, and a very typical move here is knight h6, okay? Knight h6, and if he takes on f5, we take with the knight. Why do we want a knight on f5? In order for the knight to pressure d4. Speaking of pressuring d4, how do we continue doing that? I'm going to have to play a little bit faster. How do we continue pressuring d4? C5. Very good, guys. Attacking the base of the pawn chain. Okay. C5 is right. So we also open up the c6 square for the knight, right? And I remind you guys with the speedrun, if you have specific questions, I'll answer them after the game. We still do the post-game analysis, and then I take your specific questions. Here I'm trying to give a more broad view of what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, he takes on f5, we take with the knight. See how now we have two attackers on the d4 pawn. Now you might say, well, big deal. What's the big deal? He can just take on c5, and that's something we'll talk about as well. Castles. Now we can take on d4, but if you want to play this clinically, it makes sense to hold off on that for just one more second and play. Knight c6. Or queen b6 is possible, but let's hold that thought in case he plays c3. Then we'll play queen b6. Because why? Because knight c6 is more flexible. What I mean by that is, we know we want to play this move anyway, right? We want to play this move regardless. Okay, so c3. And now that he has shown his desire to further defend that pawn, well, actually, here's the funny thing. We can take first and then play queen b6, and that way we win the pawn. But I'm going to show you guys something really cool. Let's go queen b6. I'll talk about that after the game. I'm noting that down. So in a game that I would play, I would take first. But I'm playing queen b6 with the hopes that he takes, because I'm going to show you guys a really cool idea. And I know Min knows what I'm thinking. That's right. Okay, b3. Unfortunately, he's not going to let us show it. He's just going to give us the pawn, and we take it. And there's a lot to talk about here in the advance, so this is a good game. Yeah. Now, CD, right? We've won a pawn. We've won a pawn. And not only have we won a pawn, it's a very important pawn. It breaks up his pawn chain. His entire position starts to crumble here. Knight c takes d4. And now we enter sort of already the decisive stage. We've won a pawn. We have a protected passer on d5. And Rogue Force, fantastic question, which I'll tackle after the game. Sorry to keep answering that way. I'll circle back to it, as it's fashionable to say these days. And I will actually circle back to it. Okay, so castles is a circle. All right, so now he goes king h1. So that is a good move by white. He gets out of the immediate threat of a discovery. And there's nothing that we should do here other than to think logically. Well, what haven't we done yet? What haven't we done yet in this position? What can we do? Yeah, so bishop c5 is a great move. And h5 would have also been good, but let's save that. I don't think he's going to go g4, which probably would have been the correct move. All right. Okay. What do we take with? And that's a mistake. He collapses. Thank you, Workends, for the tier 1. Bishop is right. Yeah, bishop is right. But boom. The rook is not operating in good faith. Okay. Yeah, so this is good. This is good stuff. And that is one bad faith rook, guys. I think we can all agree on that. Blackjack, thanks for the prime. Appreciate it. The rook is red right now, blue right now. Just colors. Okay, the game is over, basically. He loses his rook. He loses his rook. And... What kind? That's weird. Yeah, he loses the... Okay, g4. He does find g4. Okay. Now, one mistake that I often see players make, right, is, well, tunnel vision. You could... Specifically in the context of automatic moves. Automatic moves. When you play a move like bishop d4, a lot of people will automatically grab the rook on a1. But see the bigger picture here for a second. See the bigger picture here for a second. If you take on a1, you give up the knight. And white at least gets an exchange for the rook, and that's a significant amount of material. So do we need to take the rook immediately? Not knight e3. Now, if we play knight e3, I know that's tempting, but he simply takes the knight, folks. And then that very same bishop, which we've assigned the vital task of winning the rook, is now going to be distracted and taking the bishop. Not knight g3. We don't need to do anything. We just need to drop the knight back. The point here isn't to activate the knight. We are seeking far greener pastures. And a lot of people are asking, well, what about knight c3? Yes, knight c3 curbs his losses. That's what he should play. And he loses only his knight, but then he loses his knight. That's huge. That's already huge. All right. So, fools. What fools we were. Is in your face is a fool. You know what else was said? Oh man, I forfeited my opportunity to do that, Simon. Because I was going to say, you know what else was censored? Your face. All right. So you see how I treat people who cheer to my channel? Oh, fool's mate. Oh god. Well, that would hurt people's feelings who miss queen takes f2. All right. So, but do you guys see what I'm saying here? We simply drop the knight back, and we win the rook. And I think part of this comes from an illusion. And he goes knight c3. Kudos to my opponent. He's finding a lot of good moves. All right. How should we do now? Well, or what should we do now? Well, one way to think about it is his king is very weak. His king is very weak. And what does that mean? Well, he's played the move g4. That's opened up a direct avenue to his king. How do we exploit that avenue? Well, we can put a queen on c6, right? And that potentially sets up a discovered check. We have a lot of things we can do. We can castle. but there's no rush in castling. Let's go d4, because that does a couple of things. It secures the bishop on c3, good. It advances the passer, good. Prepares queen c6, good. And if you look at this knight on e7 on the somewhere in number 4, number 5 of our agenda, is perhaps to reactivate the knight. It's not doing all that much on e7. And what pathway does the move d4 potentially create? And you shouldn't overthink this like this is the absolute best move. It's probably not even the best move. Yeah, knight d5 and then potentially even to e3. But what I wanted to say is that there is a bit of an illusion among some people that, and this comes from a good place, but like every single move has to be active. No retreating moves. And that's why in this position, even if somebody understands the concept of just moving the knight, they still want to find an active square. And you have to have your, and sorry to belabor this, but you have to have your priorities in order. If you know that you're winning the rook, the relative position of the knight is not going to matter. It's going to matter far more that the knight is safe than that the knight is nominally more active. All right. That's just what I wanted to say. Okay, bishop b2. And as we discussed, let's slide the queen over to c6. And after king g1, again, first thing we need to ask ourselves, do we need to take on b2? The answer is clearly no. I'm going to answer for you. That's why we put a pawn on t4. What should we do after he moves his king? Look at you. Look at you. Same if it doesn't matter. Look at you. Knight d5, knight d3. There we go. Now, why aren't we castling, some people say? Because we don't need to. The king is perfectly safe. It's all alone. King g1 is a good move. And now we can go knight e3. We don't have to rush that, though. I think that now may be a good time to castle. How do we know that we don't need to? Well, it's simple. Look at the position with your own eyes. And I'm not seeing anything you're not seeing. He doesn't have... What pieces is he going to attack the king? Always consider the worst case scenario. If you gave him like 5 moves, could he even possibly generate any threats against the king? And you'll see that the answer is no. So let's castle or play rook c8. Now we're just going to castle. Not because the king is in any danger, but just, you know, just to potentially bring the rook into the game and connect the rooks. More out of that consideration. And don't overthink this. Everything wins here. It's not that important to find the move. It's not about that here. It's about making a series of reasonable moves. All right? Just wanted to make that very clear. Yeah, this is a really good game because he's defending super well. He's reporting. Okay, queen d3. No, he's gonna make a move. Now, when you've got a situation like this, I call this a standoff. Standoffs are tactically, I was going to say politically charged, well, they're all politically charged, are tactically charged on the chessboard situations. And, you know, when you have a possibility of capturing something, you need to spend at least a couple of seconds on every move, considering even if you've decided not to take, you need to spend a couple of seconds per move considering what happens if you do. Because a capture, by its very definition, changes the position in some significant way, and so that could open up the possibility for tactics here. A fork on c1, which you would see if you considered bishop takes b2, right? This is not a matter of queen c1 being hard to see. It's a matter of allowing yourself to consider the trade. That's just a small piece of advice there. Now the game is over. Okay. Let's have a look, because I'm excited to introduce you guys to the intricacies here. Good game. Bishop f5, all right? So this is the advanced Caro Kann. Bishop f5 develops the Caro Kann outside the pawn chain. Now, to understand, and I explained this, I think, reasonably well with the pawn chain analogy. But let's abstract this entirely and just consider how the pawn structure works here in the French and the Caro Kann. Because the French and the Caro Kann are very similar openings when you think about it. And to do that, we're going to employ chess base. And I'm sorry for if I'm ranting here. I'm excited. I like these explanations because I feel like they can help you understand how to play in closed positions too. So we just have the pawns here. We don't have any pieces, right? Forget the pieces. Both the Caro Kann and the French involve allowing white to control the center. Thank you, Desert Pagel, and we got a hype train at 540. Great. All right, that's fact one. And that's already why these openings weren't popular when chess began. Because when chess began, you know, people understood that you want to control the center with pawns, and so why would you voluntarily allow white to control the center with his 2 pawns? But then people came along and said, okay, in the Caro Kann and the French, black controls a part of the center, okay? In the French, black has a pawn on d5, and it's only that he has a pawn on e6. And most of the time, if white plays the advanced French, white plays e5, right? Now in the Caro Kann, this pawn is here and this pawn is here, right? But the difference structurally is minimal, almost non-existent. In fact, they can morph into each other because in the Caro Kann you often play e6 and then c5, and in the French you often play c5 in one fell swoop. All right. And as I explained, the rationale behind these 2 openings is one and the same. You lure white into creating a pawn chain, and you've got the weapons to attack this pawn chain from both sides. A, with the pawn on c5 attacking the base of the pawn chain, and B, playing the move f6, which you'll often see in the French, attacking the foot of the pawn chain. And that in turn creates piece mobility. When you break down your opponent's control of the center, it not only is inherently good, because then you control more of the center, but it also often gives your pieces more mobility. Now the main difference between the Caro Kann and the French, we need to understand it, we need to add black's dark squared bishop. All right. Now in the French, you have the very famous problem of the French bishop, whether or not white plays e5. The positive side, in 500 bits from Frank, is that, and TomTom, thank you for the sub, jeez. Positive side is that white goes c5 in one fell swoop, and in the Caro Kann, the situation is flipped. You get your bishop outside of the pawn chain, awesome. But on the other hand, you spend 2 tempi to go c5, right? And that might not seem significant, but it really is. That's a pretty significant trade-off, all right? So that's kind of a way to structurally understand the Caro Kann. Now, what's the downside of all this? Is black just better because he gets a chance to do all of this? No, because white gets a huge space advantage in both openings, or light square bishop. This pawn on e5 is a big deal. It's controlling the f6 square, which makes it hard to develop the knight. All right, so you are taking on a bunch of these challenges when you're playing particularly the Caro Kann, and a lot of these challenges center around how to develop these 2 pieces because they're struggling for resources. The knight doesn't have f6, so either it has to go out onto the rim as we did, or you have to do something like this, but then where do you put the bishop? So it often takes a long time to get your king side out, but if you do all of that and if you manage to pressure white center, white's position often collapses in a spectacular way. All right, so that's a little structural explanation. I hope that makes sense. Let's go into the game itself. No. Advancing is the main move, and I'm not trying to suggest that advancing in either the French or the Caro is bad. In the Caro Kann, the advanced variation is like basically the most popular line nowadays at the top level. And in the French, it's one of the most popular. It's by no means is it bad, but both require precision from white. So if you're a relative beginner, I don't recommend actually playing the conventional advance in either the Caro Kann or the French, unless you're willing to study it carefully, which then would make it fine. But there are alternatives. You can play the open Caro Kann. You can just play knight c3, same with the French. All right, and this is much easier to play because the center is open. But what I really recommend for people who are beginners, if you want to line against the Caro Kann, I recommend the exchange with bishop d3. Because this is a compromise. The position is not entirely open. You know, black still has a pawn. You still have this little traffic jam. There's a little bit of pawn structure imbalance. White has 3 on 2 here, and black has 4 on 3 on the other side. And white has very simple development. So I feel like this is a good compromise. That's what I think. Now, after e5, let's flip the board, bishop f5. Let's continue. No, but c4 is good. Okay, so f4 is already not a big mistake, but it's a little bit overcommittal, as I explained. And you want to time your questions to where we are in the game. So ask any questions, but please time them to where I am. Now, white has a bunch of systems here, right? And we'll face all of them. You know, there's knight c3. There's things as aggressive as g4. There's h4. You can go after, on all of these moves, try to go after this bishop immediately. And literally, like h4 tries to trap the bishop, right? That's the bottom line. Or white can emphasize development. Knight f3, bishop e2, called the short variation. That's, I would say, considered the main line. And all of those have their own theoretical continuations. He goes f4, we go e6. Now if he tries g4 here, he falls under this check. He goes bishop d3. Now knight h6. I hope this move makes sense to everybody. We are trading on our own terms. Again, one of the biggest problems that black has to solve in the Caro-Kann are these two pieces. And if we can find a home for them, then we're well on the way to reaching a good position. All right. Why not h6 and not knight e7? Well, knight e7 just blocks this bishop. That's the only thing. The downside to this move is that the knight is on the rim, but I am already anticipating that the knight has passage to f5. Frankfurt Airport, guys. The Frankfurt Airport analogy, right? You're flying to Paris. Paris is on f5. Nothing can stop us from reaching Paris. All right. It is a move after f4. It is. But I wanted to hold out until he goes bishop d3. So now we go c5, executing the main idea of the Caro-Kann. Well, Nikolov, then we can trade ourselves and go knight f5, all right? No, without f4, sometimes you do play knight h6, yes. Yes, knight h6 is a move I can show you guys from games from my career where strong GMs, I mean, I can, right off the top of my head, I can show you guys a game against the Caro-Kann expert, Peruvian Grandmaster Naroditsky that I played when I was in IM. And if you guys just want to see how this all works and what makes the Caro-Kann so mind-bogglingly complex, here you go. By all means, here it is. Here's an example of black. Here I have a Caro-Kann. Now, I played in a very interesting system. I want to see if you guys can tell me, this is a common system, what the point of getting the knight to b3 is with your newfound knowledge of the Caro-Kann. What is white's point here? Why spend 2 moves doing this crap? All right, guys. So discourage c5, exactly. Discourage c5. And you can see that my opponent goes knight h6 as early as move 6. And he's not afraid of bishop takes h6. And the reason why, and this is very complicated stuff, right? It's hard to explain this all verbally. There's concrete properties here, but you open the g file. The bottom line is that black can actually castle long and use the g file to his advantage. In addition, the absence of the dark squared bishop is going to make it much harder for white to stop c5, right? And if you preserve the bishop, then you can more easily deal with c5. So you can see, why does he put a knight on h6? To give the bishop the square on e7, and now he's developed all of his pieces. And the knight goes to f5. So you guys can see like the same types of moves are made. And that's why if you learn the Caro-Kann really well, it can be an incredibly good opening to play. Because by and large, the ideas remain the same across most lines. And you can have a very, very fun time just consistently killing people with those ideas. Okay. You still want to play c5 if you castle long sometimes, yeah? Okay. So takes, knight castles, knight c6. Now we're just putting pressure on this pawn. And, okay. If white, now very important, if white plays c3, you do not want to play c4 here. You don't want to play c4. Why not? Well, because this closes down the center even further. And I know what you want to do. You want to go b5, b4. But even after you do that, it's going to be very hard to break down this pawn, right? How do I know that? Well, I'm applying, and I introduce this to my students, as the best case scenario test. There's the best case scenario test and the worst case scenario test. Best case scenario test, let's say my opponent, you have a plan, you're trying to evaluate the merits of that plan. What you want to do is say, well, let's say my opponent gives me as many moves as possible to execute this plan. What happens afterward? Is it as good as I thought it was? b5? So let's do that. Let's say white castles and make some inoffensive moves. You get everything you wanted. Are we really going to win this pawn anytime soon? Right? No. This is a Pyrrhic victory. It looks good. This is not a serious minority attack. And you win connect 4, that is true. And so c4, do you play this ever? Absolutely. There are situations when you want to do something like this. Generally, those situations involve having far greater beef on the side of the board where you're conducting this attack. Here, we already are attacking the d4 pawn, and we have 2 attackers on it. There's no point in closing down as counterproductive. You just want to go knight c6. and then queen b6, much as we did in the game. So he went c6, he went c3. Okay, sorry for the rant. Now what happens if dc? Now this position is a really interesting one because we've already gotten all of our pieces out, but black also has a very, very pretty tactical concept. And you should already notice that the king is out of squares. Any situation where the king is out of squares, you should start thinking about tactics. What am I talking about here? This is almost winning for black. Yeah, boom, boom, boom. All right. This is as old as the hills. The h-file opens. This is covered. This is checkmate. All right, so move h5 is virtually correct. I mean, white can defend against this, but it's like very, very hard to. All right, so remember this idea, h5, h4. And that's why when you get a little bit past beginner level, you have to learn that in some situations, you have to understand, and even if you are a beginner, you can understand this, even though you shouldn't emphasize this, that in many situations, you want to keep your king in the center because that affords you opportunities that otherwise you wouldn't have. Well, knight c3 and knight e2 is the only defense, I think, because if white plays h3, then that weakens the g3 square and that wins the exchange. So this idea of the king being boxed in on the corner and the rook delivering mate from h8 is universal across a lot of openings and a lot of different positions, by the way. And this is one of those things where Soviet coaches in the old day, particularly Dvoretsky, what they recommended was keeping a notebook of what they called tactical ideas in tactical patterns, where you would assemble and literally cut diagrams out of books and stuff. And nobody's going to do this now. But every time you saw a cool tactical pattern such as this one, you would, you would print it out or whatever, and you would paste it into your physical notebook like this one, and you would label them, and every once in a while you would review all of these patterns, and that greatly enriches your tactical knowledge. Thank you, Captain Comic. And let's say that you had done this with, but let me show you the merits of that. Let's say that you had done this with this idea. And then you come across, and then you're facing, your name is Mark Taimanov. Your name is Mark Taimanov. You're facing Anatoly Karpov, who in 1977 is essentially one of the top players in the world. And you're playing the black pieces. You don't have very high hopes for winning. But you find yourself in a pretty interesting position. And you find yourself, imagine that you are Mark Taimanov, Grandmaster. Solid Grandmaster, but nowhere near the top of the top. So it's black to play. Do you notice any similarities between this and what I just showed you guys? Do you notice any similarities? All right, entertainment of channeled. Here we go. Yes, well, the queen is in the role of the bishop. It's blocking the king's access. You don't have an h-pawn, but that can actually be a good thing. So you need to tell yourself, wait a second. If there was no h2 pawn and my rook landed on the h-file, that would be checkmate. All right? So now that seems like a pipe dream because the rook is nowhere near the h-file. But if you've been doing your exercises, then you should start thinking of ways to try to make that happen, right? How can we make that happen? Well, we should notice that white's queen is tasked with defending the rook. There is a standoff between the rooks. And so the queen is overloaded. That means the queen's defense of g3, of this square, isn't actual. You can play knight g3 check and Karpov resigned. If he takes with a queen, then rook takes b1. And if he takes with a pawn, and this is a beautiful move, rook a8. And you cannot stop rook h8 checkmate. You can give up your queen on e3. Otherwise, it's completely unstoppable. So this is a combination that's shown to every Russian schoolboy. It's very pretty. And I'm not going to claim that you automatically see this if you're aware of the pattern, but you're a lot more likely to if you put your mind to it. Knight g3 check. First, you can't take with the queen because you lose. And there's no way to stop rook h8. You can convince yourself of this. Just look at every legal move in the position. There's no way. And I know it was easy right after I showed you the example, but this is not an easy position to understand, and I just wanted to Hopefully this enriches your knowledge a little bit. Rook b4, still rook h8. That's checkmate. Back to the speed. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you guys. After queen b6, the same thing would have happened in this position. We would have gone h5, h4, and knight g3. And he went b3, which exacerbates the situation. And yes, knight takes d4. Bishop c5 just developing is great, and bishop takes d4 wins the rook. And knight e7 is the best move. What's his best move there? You know, it might actually be d takes c5. And if we go h5 in this position, well, the computer always finds some way to defend against this kind of stuff. It says queen e2, and then knight g5, not an easy move to see, and white is still much worse. That is not an easy move to see. The idea is after knight g3, you have this knight h3 move to block the check, right, and block the checkmate. But white is hanging by a single thread here, and black's still got a great position. We can even castle long. Oh, we blundered the pawn, but wait a second, what was the knight doing at g5 again? Ah, it was covering the h3 square, so now this is mate. That's not an easy, that's an easy find. So at this point, his position just collapses. All right. So bishop c5. Well, if you play f6 there, then white can take on f6. You got to be careful about those kinds of moves, and always try to detect the danger. Okay. So that's the game. Yeah, takes bishop c5, and the only other important moment, knight e7, patiently retreating the knight and preserving it. So when do we castle long in the Caro? Well, there's a couple of circumstances. Usually you castle short. Certainly in most positions you castle short. But I can't answer that question too generally. Now, there are situations where, as I explained to you guys before, you put a knight on h6 and white ends up taking it, and you castle long because you want to keep the g file open for the rook. I can show you examples of that. And another scenario is, yeah, for whatever reason, you want to attack on the king side, and you judge that the risk isn't as wide. But it's definitely less prevalent than castling king side.